December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Oh, hell was breaking loose. I thought, well, what am I going to do?
He was shooting at us. I could see the red flashes of the shots at us.
And all of a sudden, a bomb hit, and then we knew it was the real thing.
The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost.
What had happened when that bomb went off, a very, very tiny piece of shrapnel went in his chest and he was killed instantly.
The people close to the explosion, all the flesh was burned off. It was hard to pick them up.
That's one of our pilots get killed, get shot down.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Special occasions like the attack on Pearl Harbor are significant enough that we need to remember them. And we need to remember why they were important to us and what happened and why it happened. And we need to make sure that history stays true.
In the beginning years of World War II, as battle raged in Europe and Asia, the United States found ways to aid democratic England as it fended off Nazi Germany. All the while, the US remained largely neutral, but in the Pacific, tensions were rising. Imperialist Japan opened hostilities against China with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, and the conflict evolved into a full-scale war between the countries. The resulting support the US offered to China and the economic sanctions it placed on Japan brought about great tensions in American-Japanese relations.
The United States decided to impose these severe embargoes on petroleum, for instance, with Japan because of its expansionist policies in China and its invasion. So that was the only tool the United States felt it could use as leverage to get the Japanese to back away from this, this adventurous policy that they were now pursuing.
Other events further strained the situation, including President Franklin Roosevelt's order to the Pacific Fleet to move from California to Hawaii in May 1940. That September, Japan signed a pact to ally with Germany and Italy, thus binding the war's main Axis powers. And so the stage for the Pacific Front was set. But for U.S. military personnel stationed on Oahu, all this stayed far from the mind. Instead, the situation there often seemed more like a vacation. For musician first class Frank Emond, a 23-year-old French horn player in the band on the battleship Pennsylvania, the environment may as well have been paradise.
It was a very, very beautiful place. I mean, we thoroughly enjoyed it there. We didn't have any money, but we played a lot of tennis. I loved the smell of the air there. The air was full of flower smells. Before World War II, it was a beautiful, small, quiet place to enjoy yourself.
But Pearl Harbor and other Hawaiian military installations remained on alert as tensions between the US and Japan were almost inevitably leaning toward war. One of their main concerns wasn't an outside attack, but sabotage within the island itself. Private Francis Schultz, a 19-year-old Army Air Forces radio operator at Wheeler Air Base in central Oahu, recalls airplanes being bunched together on runways to make them easier to guard. This is among what Schultz considers strange events prior to December 7th that would leave the U.S. military being unprepared and easy targets for the Japanese.
Our commanding officer called us into the hangar. He said, "I do not understand this." He said, "But we're going off the alert and you're free to go on pass." So the guys took off for Hawaii and Honolulu, obviously, and our planes were way back in earthen bunkers. And then the day before Pearl Harbor, we went off the alert. They brought all the planes back in, lined them up on the tarmac, and so they were just like sitting ducks.
As a pianist, Schultz's night on December 6, 1941, was spent playing in a dance band at the Officers Club elsewhere on the island. Iman was playing music that night too. Each battleship had a band, and his from the Pennsylvania performed at a recreation hall late into the night with bands from other ships. Watching in the audience were members of the Battleship Arizona's band. But on the following day, the gaiety will turn to tragedy. Japan will strike the island in a surprise attack, and the death and destruction suffered by the Arizona will become the most remembered single event of the day. And when all the dust settles, 2,403 Americans will be dead, leading the United States into the greatest armed conflict of all time.
The Japanese military decided that it was necessary to go to war with the United States, and a preemptive strike was planned for this reason, that they couldn't continue along the same path and survive long term.
7:02 on the morning of December 7th, a radar station on Oahu picks up a flight of planes more than 100 miles north of the island. These are written off as B-17 flying fortresses that are due to land, but in fact, they're 183 Japanese fighters and bombers.
When they saw these planes coming in from the Japanese task force on the radar and reported it to the officer in charge, he says, "Oh, don't worry about that. That's a big flight of planes coming in from the States."
7:49 a.m. The Japanese planes fly their routes across the island and toward the harbor on the south end. But along the way, they begin to knock out the planes and airfields elsewhere on the island. Schultz is awoken by bombs falling outside his barracks at Wheeler Field, north of Pearl Harbor.
I stood there and watched airplanes come in and bomb and strafe. We were only 50 yards from the hangar line, and it was coming right over our barracks. I just stood out there and watched it come in. Watched the airplane come in, and they were strafing at the same time.
He takes off for safety of the officers' quarters and plasters himself against a wall, waiting for the attack to end. There, he prays.
I just praying to end up alive. I didn't pray any bad things for anybody else.
Meanwhile, along Oahu's eastern coast, the Japanese are flying in to make runs at the Navy's seaplane base on Kaneohe Bay. 21-year-old Cass Phillips, a radio operator on the PBY seaplane bomber, sees a Japanese fighter as he's headed to the cafe for breakfast with a friend. But he figures it to be a U.S. plane painted for a drill.
There was an airplane that flew across right in front of us, and it was painted kind of dark green, had what we call meatballs, round red circles on the side and under the wings. So I commented to him that they were really making it look realistic, and that they had even painted their planes and to make them look like a possible enemy.
But the reality of the situation quickly makes itself apparent.
Looked down toward the hangar, and there was smoke coming up from the planes and from the hangar, and men from the barracks were running down in that direction. So then we started to realize that someone was attacking us, and for real.
Around this time, the commander of the full Japanese task force realizes there is no opposition and sends out the infamous code words, Tora, Tora, Tora. This is the signal that a complete surprise attack against the U.S. forces has been achieved. 7:55 a.m. At the command center on Ford Island in the harbor, Commander Logan Ramsey sees a plane flying low to the ground. He writes it off as a foolhardy pilot until he sees a bomb fall from it. Ramsey then orders telegraph operators to send a message to all bases and ships.
Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill.
Emond is topside on the Pennsylvania for the morning flag raising with others from the battleship's band when he sees oncoming planes.
I looked up in the sky and heard some noise and saw a line of planes coming in, small planes. The first one peeled off and dropped something, or I thought the plane was coming apart. And I watched it come all the way down the ground and hit on Ford Island in the hangar, exploded in smoke and flames. Looked back up the airplanes, we could see the big red spots on the fuselage, so we realized instantly that we were under attack.
On the USS Oklahoma, the attack prompts the battleship's command to sound the general quarters alarm.
This is not a drill. This is not a drill. General quarters, all hands man your battle stations.
Seaman Second Class Dwayne Riles, a 19-year-old signalman on the Oklahoma, is sound asleep in his bed after getting off duty at 4 a.m.
And I poked the guy next to me in another bunk, and I said, some drunk must have come back and pushed the GQ buzzer or something when he came back aboard. All of a sudden, a bomb hit, and then we knew it was the real thing.
Within the first 10 minutes of the attack, the Oklahoma will take 8 torpedo hits because of its vulnerable position on Battleship Row. This will cause the ship to roll over and sink, and it will leave Riles, who hasn't even had time to dress on top of his white undershorts, desperate for a way to escape. 8:10 a.m. The worst of all Pearl Harbor happens in a boom. The battleship Arizona explodes when a bomb hits its forward magazine. More than 1,000 aboard are killed, including all 21 members of its band. Emond considered the Arizona band members his friends.
We were friends with them because they were all our own age, just about. And we were Navy band number 8. I believe they were Navy band number 22.
Back on the Oklahoma, as the Japanese batter the ship, things are looking dire for Riles. Crew members are told to go to the better armored third deck, so Riles, his supervisor Andy Sauer, and others make their way.
So they ordered everyone that didn't have a gun station below decks, below the protective deck. And that's where I went. And all of a sudden the torpedoes started hitting us on one side, and our ship was ready for Admiral's inspection Monday morning, so all the hatches were wide open. And that's why we capsized so fast, because the water, each torpedo would fill those compartments with water.
Many will die from being trapped below, but Riles is determined to escape. He eventually spots a large porthole.
I had to get out of that third deck hatch when the ship started rolling over because water was coming in. And then I started through the ship trying to get out of the thing, and I'm walking on the bulkheads. It's laying on its side by that time, and steady walking on the deck, and so I was having quite a time. I looked up there and saw that porthole. I said, that looks like the only way out of this thing right now. So I did, and I made it out of the porthole.
8:35 a.m. The first attack wave departs from the harbor and heads back toward the Japanese aircraft carriers north of Oahu. The destruction in their wake is enormous. The battleships California and West Virginia are sunk. The Oklahoma is sunk and capsized, and the Arizona becomes a blurred image of metal, smoke, and fire. But the Americans won't have long to tend to their losses. 10 or so minutes before 9 a.m., a second wave of 167 Japanese fighters and bombers storms southward across Oahu, again hitting the airfields first.
Someone looked up toward the north, and here they came again, and they said, oh, here they come again.
At the Navy base at Kaneohe Bay, Phillips heads for the hangar for refuge. Nearby, a 32-year-old chief petty officer named John Finn is defending Kaneohe with a .50 caliber machine gun. For this, he'll earn World War II's first Medal of Honor.
So he stood out there for during the entire attack, the second attack, firing at those planes, being wounded, I believe it was 22 times, and consequently he was given the Medal of Honor, and which he absolutely deserved.
At Wheeler Field, radio operator Schultz makes it to a sandbag emplacement with a radio to communicate with Army headquarters at Fort Shafter. While there, Schultz comes under enemy fire.
As we were talking on the phone, they were strafing us, and so, in fact, a bullet just went right in my ear. Everything was it was absolute pandemonium.
Wheeler has taken great hits to its planes and infrastructure, but 4 of the 11 U.S. fighter planes that managed to get airborne during the attack come from Wheeler. The 4 get into a dogfight with 8 Japanese Zeros. 3 of the 4 U.S. pilots get a kill each, but one of them, Second Lieutenant Gordon Sterling, doesn't live to tell about it.
Some in the air, one of our pilots, I saw one of our pilots get killed, get shot down, because they're not flying high, they were right close to the ground. And so it was one big mess.
Back at Pearl Harbor, Riles is now free from the capsized Oklahoma and is standing on top of what had been the starboard side. He slides down the ship and into the water and swims over to the nearby battleship Maryland, which has been spared of any heavy damage in the attack. He grabs onto a rope dangling from the side of the Maryland, and a crew member lifts him up.
They helped me get aboard. They threw a line down there, saw me down there trying to climb aboard the ship. And then I got some clothes when I got on there out of a bucket. Some guy had been soaking his clothes, going to wash them on the Maryland. They were sitting there, and I pulled them out, and I put them on.
But the Japanese planes are still making runs, so Riles helps by passing ammo to a deck gun.
Everybody was doing their job, and like it was a drill. And that's the real thing.
Like the Maryland, the Pennsylvania has been mostly spared. Its position in dry dock has guarded it against enemy torpedoes, so most of its crew has stayed safe. But at 9:06 a.m., the Pennsylvania situation takes a terrible turn. Bombs from high-level bombers hit the battleship, as well as one of the 2 destroyers docked immediately in front of her named the Downs. Eamon's job during combat is to serve as a stretcher bearer, so he heads to the dark hole the bomb formed in the Pennsylvania to recover bodies.
The people close to the explosion, all the flesh was burned off. So it was hard to pick them up, because you couldn't grab them by the legs or arms or anything, because the flesh was all loose. We got to pick the people up by the shoes and around the neck and the hair in order to get them in the stretcher.
9:41 a.m. The damage from the bomb that hit the Downs has resulted in fire and explosions for both it and the neighboring destroyer, the Cassin. The fire reaches ordnance on the Downs, and the resulting explosion rips through both the destroyers and also damages the Pennsylvania. By 10 a.m., about 2 hours after it began, the attack is over. Japanese pilots want to strike with a third wave, but their superiors deny that request because they deem it had already been a success.
At the 11th hour, or at least at the last minute, Nagumo, who's in charge of this operation, overall operation, decided that the United States might retaliate, that there might be some sort of reaction from the aircraft carriers off the Pearl Harbor base. And so he kind of did not want to continue and put his group at risk. So it was kind of a cautionary move made by the Japanese. But in the process, of course, he didn't pursue a more demolishing effort of taking out the oil dumps and everything else that could have effectively crippled the Pacific Fleet.
Those on Oahu are left to pick up the pieces. They also ready themselves for another strike.
The rest of that day was mostly spent with trying to get ready for the next attack. We thought they would come back and really try to take the island.
I was wandering around the streets mostly and didn't know what to do. I didn't have a ship anymore. And in fact, I went to 2 or 3 hotels and thinking about getting a room. And they was whorehouses instead of hotels.
We were instructed to put on dark trousers and long sleeve sweaters and stocking caps, black shoes. And we were issued rifles and ammunition.
So they passed the word around. Everybody come down to a certain place. We have a pot of tea. And so we took off our whites, put them in this pot, and what that did was dye them, and that was supposed to be a camouflage, so that if they came back, and we thoroughly expected them to come back, and we thought they would maybe invade, but luckily and happily that did not happen.
Later, aboard a Navy plane, Phillips gets a look from above at Battleship Row.
You know that there got to be a lot of dead people down there. And at that age, 21, that's pretty young. You don't really, most people don't have too deep of thoughts, I don't think, about that. You know it's something that happened, you're sorry it happened, but you didn't know any of them. You don't have any one person to pin it on, a good friend or a relative or anything like that.
The final damage and casualty assessments are staggering. 12 ships are sunk or severely damaged, and another 9 need major repairs. The Army Air Corps and the Navy have lost 169 planes, and 2,403 Americans are dead, including 1,177 aboard the Arizona, 429 on the Oklahoma, and 68 civilians. By comparison, the Japanese losses of 29 planes, 5 midget submarines, and 55 service members are minimal. But the U.S. will recover. All but 3 ships will return to service, and the survivors of the attack will go on to fight in the Pacific Front. Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor with a fleet that included 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. But by the time the country surrenders in September 1945, only one, the destroyer Ushio, will survive. After the war, Pearl Harbor survivors stayed in the service, or got a college education, or started careers and families. Spread throughout the country, they'd get together for reunions, and eventually, in 1958, they formalized their organization, calling it the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association. The organization evolved into state and regional chapters, and survivors gathered for annual remembrances, including at Pearl Harbor itself. In 1985, the organization was chartered by Congress. But in the years following, keeping it together became harder as the youngest members aged into their 70s and 80s, and many began to encounter health problems or pass away. So in 2011, 70 years after the attack, the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association disbanded. Today, an estimated 2,300 or fewer service members are living from the original 84,000 there for the attack.
I think anybody who's been a victim of these sorts of attacks, you want to learn from their living links to these major events. And I think we also want to honor them in the sense that they had to withstand the pressures of war in ways that most of us never have to.
Few are still able to join the nearly 2 million annual visitors who journey to the site of where it all happened, so they do what they can closer to home to keep the memory alive, especially around the time of the anniversary.
We go in every chance we get and do what we can to help them out with school children, teach them, tell them stories.
When reflecting on Pearl Harbor, they focus mainly on how unprepared the U.S. was.
We knew that we were going to have a war over there. but we were like taking a club against a group that had machine guns.
That's really the bad part, is to know that our people who should have known, should have done something, should have had people ready for that, didn't. Now you can't just forget that.
And all the while, their approach stays humble.
I'm very proud of the fact that I contributed something to it. It wasn't much, but it was the best I could do.
Once a year, you're a real hero. Although you know you're not really a hero, they call you one and they say they think you are. But of course, we who just happened to be there when it happened, we did what we could.
It's over with and we made it, and every survivor's got his own tale and story to tell.
I think there were a lot of this people just the same as me. You were doing a job and you just did what you're supposed to do is all.